The sleek glass headquarters of Pinnacle Technologies dominated the Boston skyline, its 52 stories of gleaming windows reflecting the bright summer sun. On the 48th floor, 25-year-old James Wilson sat nervously in the modern reception area of the executive suite, his worn backpack at his feet and a portfolio clutched in his slightly trembling hands. A Harvard computer science degree had landed him this interview, but his appearance, simple khaki pants and a button-up shirt that had seen better days, betrayed his modest background. The receptionist had already given him a disapproving once-over when he arrived. Now, as the minutes ticked by, James rehearsed his presentation in his mind, knowing this internship could change the trajectory of his entire career. What he didn't know was that in exactly 17 minutes, Alexander Grant, the notoriously demanding CEO of Pinnacle Technologies, would look him in the eye and destroy his dreams with 5 devastating words: "You're too stupid to work here." And those words would set in motion a chain of events that would irrevocably change both of their lives. If this story resonates with you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. At 47, Alexander Grant had built Pinnacle Technologies from a startup in his garage to a $3.2 billion industry leader. His reputation for brilliance was matched only by his reputation for ruthlessness. Former employees described him as devastatingly smart and equally cruel. Industry magazines quoted him saying he only hired the brightest minds in the country. Everyone else is just wasting oxygen. He'd been sued twice for workplace harassment, settling both cases for undisclosed amounts while admitting no wrongdoing. Today, Alexander was in an even fouler mood than usual. A major acquisition deal was teetering on the edge of collapse after months of negotiation, and the quarterly earnings report due next week was projected to miss analyst expectations for the first time in Pinnacle's history. His executive assistant had already quit after a particularly brutal morning meeting, leaving a hastily scrawled resignation letter and a half-empty cup of coffee on her desk. When Alexander stormed past reception toward his office, the receptionist nervously called out, "Mr. Grant, your 1 o'clock interview is here, the Harvard intern candidate." Alexander stopped, turning slowly. "The what?" "The summer internship interview. Human Resources scheduled it weeks ago. They sent the file up this morning." She gestured toward James, who had stood up quickly, portfolio in hand, attempting a confident smile. "Are you kidding me?" Alexander snapped. "I don't have time for this today." "Sir," James stepped forward, extending his hand. "I'm James Wilson. It's an honor to meet you. I've followed your work since your first enterprise security algorithm." Alexander cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Fine. 5 minutes. That's all you get." He turned and walked toward his office, not checking if James was following. James hurried after him, his heart racing. This wasn't how he'd imagined the interview starting, but at least he had a chance. 5 minutes to impress the Alexander Grant. He could make this work. Alexander's office was minimalist and imposing, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Boston Harbor. He didn't sit down or invite James to do so. Instead, he leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "All right, Harvard, impress me. Why should I waste a summer internship slot on you?" James took a deep breath and launched into his prepared introduction. "I've developed a new approach to quantum encryption that I believe could revolutionize Pinnacle's security architecture. My thesis advisor said it's at least 2 years ahead of current industry standards." "Show me," Alexander said flatly, holding out his hand. James quickly opened his portfolio and pulled out a USB drive, along with several printed pages of code and diagrams. "Here's the prototype algorithm and test results. I've successfully encrypted and decrypted data at speeds 40% faster than the current." Alexander was already scanning through the pages, his expression unreadable. After a few moments, he looked up with narrowed eyes. "Where did you steal this from?" James blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" "This code. It's similar to a proprietary project we're working on. Did one of my engineers leak it to you? Is this some kind of corporate espionage? What? No. James was genuinely shocked. This is my original work. I've been developing it for over a year as part of my thesis. I can show you all my research notes, the evolution of the algorithm. Alexander tossed the papers onto his desk. Either you're lying or you're delusional. This approach was theorized by our R&D team months ago, but even they haven't solved the quantum decoherence problem that's clearly present in your third subroutine. With respect, Mr. Grant, I have solved that problem, James said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. If you look at the modular structure on page 4... I don't need to look at page 4, Alexander cut in, his voice dripping with disdain. I can see the flaws in your logic from here. Your approach would collapse under any real-world application. James felt his face growing hot, but he persisted. I've run over 3,000 simulations that prove... Simulations? Alexander laughed coldly. Let me guess, on university equipment, with theoretical data sets? That's not the real world, kid. The principles are sound, James insisted. The mathematics are basic at best, derivative at worst. Alexander stepped closer, towering over James. Harvard must be lowering their standards. There's no way this half-baked concept deserves a degree, let alone an internship at my company. James stood his ground, though he could feel his hands shaking. Mr. Grant, if you'd just give me a chance to explain the full implementation. I've seen enough, Alexander said, cutting him off again. You're too stupid to work here, or maybe you're just arrogant enough to think you can pass off subpar work as innovation. He gathered the papers and thrust them back at James. Either way, we're done. My receptionist will show you out. The words hit James like a physical blow. Too stupid to work here. His face burned with humiliation as he automatically took the papers. 5 years of education, thousands of hours of research, his entire future plan, all dismissed in 5 minutes. Mr. Grant, We're done, Alexander repeated, already turning back to his desk. He pressed his intercom. Caroline, escort Mr. E. Wilson out, and tell HR to stop wasting my time with these so-called prodigies. As James was led out, he passed a group of executives waiting to meet with Alexander. From their sympathetic glances, he knew they had overheard everything. The humiliation was complete. In the elevator down to the lobby, James stood in stunned silence, his portfolio clutched to his chest. Too stupid to work here. The words echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. By the time he reached the street, the shock had begun to give way to a burning anger. He knew his work was good. No, it was exceptional. Alexander Grant hadn't even taken the time to understand it. That evening, in his small apartment that he shared with 2 other graduate students, James sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. His roommates had tried to console him, offering beer and reassurances that Alexander Grant was known to be a complete asshole, and that James would find a better internship. But James couldn't let it go. The dismissal felt too personal, too unfair. He opened his encryption algorithm again, reviewing it line by line. After 3 hours of scrutiny, he was even more certain his work was solid. The approach was innovative, the mathematics sound. James reached for his phone and pulled up an email he'd received just last week, an offer for a different internship at Quantum Dynamics, Pinnacle's smaller but well-respected competitor. He had been holding off on accepting, hoping for the Pinnacle position. Now, with a newfound determination, he composed a response accepting the offer. Just as he was about to hit send, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a Boston area code. "Hello," James answered cautiously. "Is this James Wilson?" The voice was female, professional. "Yes, this is James. James, this is Dr. Elizabeth Chen, Director of Research at the National Quantum Computing Initiative. I hope I'm not calling too late." James sat up straighter. The NQCI was the government's elite research program for quantum computing. with a budget larger than most tech companies and security clearance requirements that made it nearly impossible to join. "No, not at all, Dr. Chen. How can I help you?" "I understand you interviewed at Pinnacle Technologies today," she said, getting straight to the point. James's stomach dropped. Had word of his humiliation spread so quickly? "Yes, I did," he admitted, "and I'm guessing from Alexander Grant's reputation that it didn't go well," Dr. Chen continued, a hint of sympathy in her voice. "That's an understatement," James replied carefully. "Well, his loss might be our gain. Your professor at Harvard, Dr. Sanjay Kapoor, is an old colleague of mine. He's been telling me about your work for months, and I'm very interested in your approach to quantum encryption." James could hardly believe what he was hearing. You are?" "Indeed. In fact, we'd like to offer you a position in our advanced research division for the summer. It's not an internship, it's a paid contractor role with the possibility of permanent employment after graduation. The security clearance process usually takes months, but we've already started the paperwork based on Dr. Kapoor's recommendation. By the time the call ended 30 minutes later, James had accepted the position. The salary was triple what Pinnacle had been offering for the internship, and the work would directly build on his encryption research. It was, by any measure, a far better opportunity than what he had lost. As he sat in the dark of his apartment, James felt a complex mix of emotions: vindication, relief, excitement, but also a lingering anger at Alexander Grant's dismissal. Too stupid to work here. Those words still stung, even with this new opportunity in hand. James had no way of knowing that in 3 months those words would come back to haunt Alexander Grant in ways neither of them could imagine. The summer passed in a blur of high-level research, classified briefings, and groundbreaking work. The NQCI's resources made Harvard's labs look primitive by comparison, and James thrived in the intellectually stimulating environment. His encryption algorithm was not only validated but expanded upon by the team of world-class researchers. By August, his work had attracted attention at the highest levels of government. A quantum-secure communication system was exactly what several agencies had been seeking, and James found himself in meetings with generals and cabinet secretaries, explaining his work with growing confidence. Dr. Chen became a mentor, guiding him through both the technical challenges and the political landscape of government-funded research. "You have a rare gift, James," she told him after a particularly successful presentation to military officials. "You see patterns where others see only complexity." The irony wasn't lost on James. 3 months ago, Alexander Grant had deemed him too stupid to work at Pinnacle. Now he was briefing the Secretary of Defense on technology that would shape national security for decades to come. Meanwhile, at Pinnacle Technologies, Alexander Grant's summer had gone in the opposite direction. The acquisition deal had fallen through completely. The quarterly earnings had indeed missed expectations, and the company's stock had dropped nearly 20% as a result. Tech industry blogs were publishing articles with headlines like, "Has Pinnacle lost its edge, and Grant's glory days behind him?" To make matters worse, Pinnacle's own quantum encryption project was stalling. The technical challenges that James had solved in his algorithm were proving insurmountable for Pinnacle's team, and a major government contract hung in the balance. On a sweltering September afternoon, Alexander sat in his office reviewing the latest disappointing progress report from his R&D department. The deadline for the government contract bid was just 2 weeks away, and they were nowhere near a working prototype. His new executive assistant knocked tentatively on his open door. "Mr. Grant, the National Security Advisor's office is on line 1. They said it's regarding the encryption contract." Alexander frowned. This couldn't be good news. He picked up the phone, putting on his most confident voice. "Alexander Grant speaking." "Mr. Grant, this is Thomas Reynolds, Deputy National Security Advisor. I'm calling to inform you that the deadline for the quantum encryption contract has been moved up. We'll need all bids submitted by the end of this week. Alexander's grip tightened on the phone. That's impossible. The original deadline was September 30th. Moving it up by more than 2 weeks is unreasonable. I understand your concern, Reynolds replied, his tone making it clear he didn't particularly care. However, recent developments have accelerated our timeline. One of our contractors has already delivered a working prototype that exceeds our specifications. We're simply giving other vendors the opportunity to compete before we make a final decision. Alexander felt a chill despite the warm office. A working prototype? Who? I'm not at liberty to disclose that information at this time. You'll receive the updated RFP requirements within the hour. Good day, Mr. Grant. The line went dead, leaving Alexander staring at the phone in disbelief. A working prototype? From which competitor, Google, IBM, Microsoft, all had quantum computing divisions, but none were thought to be ahead of Pinnacle in encryption technology. Alexander spent the next hour making urgent calls to industry contacts, trying to discover who had leapfrogged Pinnacle's technology. No one seemed to know, or those who did weren't talking. Finally, he called an emergency meeting with his R&D team. 20 engineers and scientists crowded into the conference room, anxiety evident on their faces. Alexander rarely called such meetings, and when he did, careers often ended. Someone has beaten us to a working quantum encryption prototype, he announced without preamble. I need to know how, and I need to know if we can catch up in 4 days. Dr. Raymond Chen, Pinnacle's chief science officer, looked particularly uncomfortable. 4 days. That's not possible, Alexander. We're at least 3 weeks from a stable implementation. Not acceptable, Alexander snapped. What's the obstacle? It's still the quantum decoherence problem, Dr. Chen explained. We can't maintain quantum state long enough for practical encryption. Every approach we've tried has failed under real-world conditions. Alexander paced the length of the conference room. Who could have solved this? Who are we overlooking? An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Finally, a young engineer named Maya Santos spoke up. There was that Harvard student, sir, the one who interviewed for the summer internship. Alexander stopped pacing. What Harvard student? James Wilson, Maya said. He claimed to have solved the decoherence problem in his thesis work. I reviewed his file after the interview. His approach was unorthodox, but it might have worked. Alexander's face darkened. That was theoretical nonsense, untested. Actually, Maya continued, her voice growing more confident, I ran some simulations based on his published papers. His math checked out. We didn't pursue it because I said he was too stupid to work here. Alexander finished flatly. The room fell silent again. Everyone knew Alexander's temper and his unwillingness to admit mistakes. Find out where Wilson is now, Alexander ordered his assistant, and get me everything he's published since graduation. Yes, sir, she replied, already typing on her tablet. Dr. Chen cleared his throat. Alexander, even if Wilson's approach is valid, we can't just appropriate his work. There would be intellectual property issues, possibly even legal. I'm not suggesting we steal anything, Alexander cut in. But if his approach works, we need to know. Maybe we can bring him in as a consultant. The irony of the suggestion wasn't lost on anyone in the room, though no one dared point it out. Sir, his assistant spoke up. According to his LinkedIn profile, James Wilson is now working as a research contractor at the National Quantum Computing Initiative. Alexander's blood ran cold. The NQCI was a direct pipeline to government contracts, exactly the kind of contract Pinnacle was now in danger of losing. Get him on the phone, Alexander demanded. Offer him whatever he wants, double his current salary. As the team dispersed to their various tasks, Alexander returned to his office, a sense of dread settling in his stomach. Had his arrogance cost Pinnacle a groundbreaking technology? Had he dismissed the very person who now held the key to the company's largest potential contract? The call to James went straight to voicemail. So did the second and third attempts. By the next morning, Alexander had his answer, an email from James's NQCI address, politely but firmly declining any meeting or discussion. As you stated during our interview, I am too stupid to work at Pinnacle Technologies. I must therefore assume any value I could provide to your company would be negligible. I wish you success in your future endeavors. The message was professional, measured, and devastatingly final. Alexander had never been on the receiving end of such a rejection, and it stung more than he cared to admit. That afternoon, the updated RFP arrived from the government. The technical specifications matched James Wilson's approach almost exactly. Pinnacle had 2 days to submit a working prototype they didn't have, using technology they had dismissed. Alexander called an emergency board meeting. For the first time in his career, he faced the very real possibility of failure on a scale that could threaten his leadership of the company he had founded. The board meeting was tense, with several members openly questioning Alexander's judgment in dismissing Wilson without properly evaluating his work. "This could cost us the largest government contract in our history," said Eleanor Park, the longest-serving board member. "All because you couldn't be bothered to listen to a young researcher for 5 minutes. "I made a mistake," Alexander admitted, the words foreign to his tongue. "But we need to focus on solutions now, not recriminations. We have 48 hours to produce a working prototype." "That's impossible, and you know it," replied Harold Thompson, another board member. "Our team can't solve in 2 days what they haven't solved in 6 months. "Then we need to convince Wilson to work with us," Alexander insisted. "After how you treated him." "Good luck with that," Eleanor scoffed. "You publicly humiliated the young man, called him stupid, and now you expect him to bail you out." The meeting continued in this vein for another hour, with no solutions emerging. Alexander left feeling something he rarely experienced: fear. For the first time, his position as CEO felt precarious. If Pinnacle lost this contract, the board might well decide they needed new leadership. That evening, Alexander did something he'd never done before. He drove to the modest apartment building where James Wilson lived, determined to make a personal appeal. James was understandably shocked when he opened his door to find Alexander Grant standing there. "Mr. Grant, what are you doing here?" James asked, instinctively blocking the doorway. "I need 5 minutes of your time," Alexander said, his usual commanding tone replaced with something almost humble. "Please." Against his better judgment, James allowed Alexander into the small living room. His roommates were out, sparing them both the awkwardness of witnesses. "I made a mistake," Alexander began, the words still difficult to say. "I dismissed your work without giving it proper consideration. That was unprofessional and wrong." James crossed his arms, saying nothing. "I understand you're working with the NQCI now," Alexander continued. "Congratulations, that's a prestigious position." "What do you want, Mr. Grant?" James asked directly. Alexander sighed. "I want to discuss the possibility of collaboration between Pinnacle and the NQCI on the quantum encryption contract." "That's not possible," James replied immediately. "My work is now government property, and any collaboration would need to go through proper channels that take months, not days. We could expedite—" "No," James cut him off. "We couldn't, and frankly, I wouldn't if we could." Alexander felt a flash of his old anger, quickly suppressed. This contract could determine Pinnacle's future. Hundreds of jobs are at stake. "You should have thought of that before you decided I was too stupid to work there," James replied, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Alexander's growing desperation. "What do you want?" Alexander asked finally. "An apology? Public acknowledgement? A job offer? Name it?" James considered him for a long moment. "What I want isn't something you can give me, Mr. Grant. I wanted respect for my work. I wanted a fair evaluation of my ideas. Those things can't be granted retroactively." "Everyone makes mistakes," Alexander argued. "Even CEOs." "Yes, they do," James agreed. "And now you get to live with yours." As Alexander left the apartment, he realized that for the first time in his career, he had encountered a problem he couldn't solve with money, power, or intimidation. He had wounded James Wilson's pride in a way no apology could heal, and now that wound would likely cost Pinnacle its future. The next 2 days passed in a blur of desperate activity at Pinnacle. Engineers worked around the clock, trying to implement a version of James's approach based on his published papers, but without his full algorithm, they made little progress. On the day the bids were due, Alexander received a call from Thomas Reynolds at the National Security Advisor's office. "Mr. Grant, I'm calling to inquire about Pinnacle's bid for the encryption contract. We're still finalizing some details," Alexander hedged. "We may need a short extension." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Reynolds replied. "The deadline is firm. Without a working prototype by 5 p.m. today, Pinnacle will be eliminated from consideration." Alexander closed his eyes, defeat washing over him. "I understand." After hanging up, he called another board meeting. It was time to face the music. As the board members gathered, Alexander prepared to announce Pinnacle's failure to meet the contract deadline. But before he could begin, his assistant burst into the room. "Mr. Grant, the Secretary of Defense is holding a press conference. They're announcing the encryption contract award." Alexander turned to the large screen on the conference room wall. "Put it on." The secretary appeared at a podium, flanked by military officials and a small group of civilians. Alexander recognized Dr. Elizabeth Chen from the NQCI, and standing slightly behind her was James Wilson, looking both proud and slightly uncomfortable in what appeared to be a new suit. "Today, I'm pleased to announce a historic partnership between the Department of Defense and the National Quantum Computing Initiative," the secretary began. "After extensive testing and evaluation, we have selected the NQCI's quantum encryption protocol as the new standard for all classified communication systems." Alexander felt the eyes of every board member on him as the secretary continued. "This revolutionary technology, developed primarily by NQCI researcher James Wilson, represents a quantum leap forward in secure communications. Mr. Wilson's approach has solved problems that have stymied the industry for years." The camera panned to James, who nodded modestly at the acknowledgement. "The initial contract, valued at $2.4 billion over 5 years, will include implementation across all DoD systems, with potential expansion to other government agencies." A murmur ran through the boardroom. $2.4 billion, nearly 5 times what they had estimated the contract to be worth. "Additionally," the secretary continued, "we have decided to make portions of this technology available to selected private sector partners under strict licensing agreements. This unprecedented step reflects our belief in the critical importance of quantum-secure communications for national infrastructure and economic security." As the press conference concluded, the boardroom erupted in questions and accusations, all directed at Alexander. He barely heard them, his attention fixed on the screen where James Wilson was now shaking hands with the Secretary of Defense. The young man Alexander had dismissed as too stupid to work here had just secured a government contract worth billions and was now in a position to determine which private companies would have access to his technology. The irony was not lost on Alexander or anyone else in the room. His single moment of arrogance might well have sealed Pinnacle's fate. As the board meeting dissolved into chaos, Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mr. Grant, I hear Pinnacle might be interested in becoming a private sector partner on the DoD contract. My office hours are 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Unlike some, I make time to listen to all potential collaborators, regardless of their previous mistakes. J.W." Alexander stared at the message for a long moment. James Wilson was offering him a lifeline, albeit one that came with a hefty dose of humility. For a man who had built his career on never backing down and never admitting fault, the choice was excruciating. Accept James's offer and publicly acknowledge his error, or refuse and potentially watch Pinnacle fade into irrelevance. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. The next morning, Alexander Grant, CEO of Pinnacle Technologies, sat in the waiting area outside James Wilson's modest government office. As executives from Google and Microsoft walked past, doing double takes at seeing the notorious Alexander Grant waiting like any other visitor, he contemplated how quickly fortunes could change. The door opened, and James appeared, dressed in a simple button-down shirt, not unlike the one he'd worn to his Pinnacle interview. "Mr. Grant," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for coming. Please, come in." Alexander took the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. This was not the nervous graduate student he had dismissed 3 months ago. "Thank you for seeing me," Alexander replied, following James into the office. "Everyone deserves a fair hearing," James said, the subtle emphasis on everyone not lost on Alexander. "Even those who might initially seem, how did you put it, too stupid to be worth your time?" Alexander winced at hearing his own words thrown back at him. "I deserved that." "Yes, you did," James agreed, taking a seat behind his desk. "Now, let's talk about what Pinnacle can bring to this partnership. I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on scaling the implementation across legacy systems." As the meeting progressed, Alexander found himself in the unfamiliar position of being the supplicant rather than the power broker. James was professional and courteous, but made no effort to hide that he was now the one in control. By the end of the hour, they had outlined a potential partnership that would give Pinnacle access to the encryption technology, though on terms far less favorable than they would have enjoyed had they been the primary contractor. "I'll have my team draft an agreement," James said as the meeting concluded. "We should be able to move forward within the week, assuming all the security clearances check out." "Thank you," Alexander said, standing to leave. "And James, I truly am sorry for how I treated you. You deserved better." James studied him for a moment, as if weighing the sincerity of the apology. "Apology accepted, Mr. Grant, though I should thank you, in a way." "Thank me?" Alexander asked, puzzled. "If you hadn't rejected me so thoroughly, I might never have accepted the NQCI position," James explained, "and I certainly wouldn't be sitting on this side of the desk today." As Alexander left the government building, he reflected on the bizarre turn of events. His momentary arrogance had cost Pinnacle billions in direct contracts and forced them into a subordinate partnership role. It had also transformed a promising young graduate into a power player in the tech world overnight. The lesson was painful but clear. In the modern world, true power doesn't come from titles or corner offices. It comes from innovation and ideas. And those can come from anywhere, even from someone you might initially dismiss as too stupid to work here. 6 months after his humiliating meeting in James Wilson's government office, Alexander Grant sat alone in his spacious corner office at Pinnacle Technologies, staring out at the Boston skyline. The winter sun cast long shadows across the city, mirroring the shadows that had fallen across his once unstoppable career. The partnership with the NQCI had saved Pinnacle from immediate disaster, providing access to the revolutionary quantum encryption technology that James Wilson had developed. But the terms had been stringent, the licensing fees steep, and the public narrative devastating. Tech blogs and business journals had feasted on the story of how Alexander Grant had dismissed the very researcher whose innovation now powered the largest government cybersecurity contract in history. A Fortune magazine profile had been particularly brutal. "Grant's Folly: How One CEO's Arrogance Cost His Company Billions." The article had detailed the fateful interview, quoting anonymous Pinnacle employees who had overheard Alexander's dismissal of James. It had gone on to analyze the financial impact, the direct loss of the $2.4 billion contract, the estimated $900 million in licensing fees Pinnacle would pay over 5 years, and the 28% drop in stock price that had followed the announcement. Pinnacle's board had been surprisingly merciful, allowing Alexander to retain his position as CEO for now, but their patience was wearing thin, and the quarterly board meeting scheduled for tomorrow loomed like a guillotine. The company's recovery plan was behind schedule, and competitors were circling like sharks, sensing weakness. A knock at his door interrupted Alexander's brooding. His executive assistant, the fourth in 6 months, poked her head in cautiously. "Mr. Grant, the executive team is assembled for the pre-board briefing." Alexander nodded, gathering the presentation materials from his desk. "Thank you, Jennifer. I'll be right there." As he walked to the conference room, Alexander noted the subtle changes in how employees responded to him. Gone was the fearful deference that had once parted crowds in the hallways. Now there were whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached, sidelong glances that conveyed a mixture of pity and schadenfreude. The executive team was already seated when he arrived. The CFO, CTO, COO, and various division heads, all wearing expressions that ranged from concerned to resigned. This was the group that had once executed his vision without question. Now they brought contingency plans and exit strategies to every meeting. "Let's get started," Alexander said, taking his place at the head of the table. "Tomorrow's board meeting is critical. We need to present a unified front and a clear path forward." For the next 2 hours, they reviewed the quarterly performance metrics, the progress on new product initiatives, and the ongoing integration of the NQCI encryption technology. The numbers weren't catastrophic, but they weren't impressive either. Pinnacle was treading water while its competitors surged ahead. "The board is going to want more than this," said Marcus Chen, the CFO, gesturing at the projections on the screen. "We're showing stability, not growth. After the NQCI debacle, stability isn't enough." Alexander bristled at the characterization, but couldn't dispute it. "What do you suggest, Marcus?" "We need a bold move," Marcus replied. "Something that changes the narrative from Pinnacle is recovering to Pinnacle is innovating again." "The R&D pipeline is solid," offered Dr. Raymond Chen, the Chief Science Officer, "but nothing revolutionary in the short term. We've been focused on integration rather than innovation since the adjustment." The euphemism wasn't lost on anyone. The adjustment had been a frantic reorganization to accommodate the licensed technology from NQCI, a process that had consumed resources and attention for months. "What about acquisitions?" suggested Teresa Vasquez, the head of strategy. "We've been approached by several promising startups." "With our stock price," Marcus scoffed, "any acquisition would be prohibitively expensive right now." The conversation continued in this vein, each potential solution running into practical or financial obstacles. As the meeting wound down, Alexander felt a familiar sense of frustration building. He had always been a man of action, of decisive leadership. This slow, collective deliberation was foreign to his nature. "All right," he said finally. "We'll present the current numbers and the integration progress. I'll take responsibility for the past mistakes and outline our focus on rebuilding. The board knows we're in a transition period." The lack of enthusiasm around the table was palpable. This wasn't a strategy for success. It was a plea for more time. As the team filed out, Marcus hung back, waiting until they were alone. "Alexander," he began, the use of his first name signaling the seriousness of the conversation. "I've been with Pinnacle for 12 years. I believe in this company, but the board is losing confidence, and we both know it." Alexander sighed. "I'm aware, Marcus. I've spoken with several members individually." "Then you know that tomorrow may be more than a routine review. There's talk of a leadership change." The words hung in the air between them. Alexander had founded Pinnacle, had built it from nothing into an industry leader. The idea that he could be removed was both preposterous and increasingly plausible. "Let them talk," Alexander said with more confidence than he felt. "I've navigated Pinnacle through challenges before." "Not like this," Marcus replied. "This isn't a technical challenge or a market shift. This is about confidence, in your judgment, in your leadership." "Because of Wilson?" Alexander asked, his tone hardening. "Not just that. It's how you handled it afterward. The confrontational approach with the NQCI, the refusal to publicly acknowledge the error, The way you've isolated yourself from the team during the recovery." Marcus trailed off, then added gently, "Some board members feel you've lost the qualities that made you an effective leader." Alexander wanted to argue, to defend himself, but a part of him recognized the truth in Marcus's words. He had retreated into his executive suite, delegating the messy work of reorganization while nursing his wounded pride. "I appreciate your frankness," Alexander said finally. "I'll consider your perspective before tomorrow's meeting." Ati. After Marcus left, Alexander returned to his office, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on his shoulders. Was this how it ended? Not with a triumphant exit at a time of his choosing, but with a humiliating board vote forcing him out of the company he had created? As evening fell, Alexander found himself driving aimlessly through Boston, eventually stopping at a small park overlooking the harbor. The same harbor he could see from his office 48 floors up, though from this vantage point the view was quite different. He sat on a bench, watching the lights of the city reflect on the dark water. How had things unraveled so quickly? 6 months ago, he had been at the pinnacle of his career, the undisputed leader of a thriving technology company. Now he was facing the very real possibility of being ousted by his own board. And it had all started with those 5 words, "You're too stupid to work here." Words spoken in haste, in arrogance, without proper consideration of the young man standing before him or the ideas he was presenting. Words that had come back to haunt him in ways he could never have imagined. As Alexander sat contemplating his situation, his phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from his assistant, forwarding a press release that had just gone public. The subject line made his heart skip. NQCI announces expansion of private sector partnerships for quantum technology. Alexander opened the email, scanning the press release quickly. The NQCI was expanding access to its quantum encryption technology, inviting new companies to apply for partnership status. The selection process would be competitive, with only a limited number of new licenses granted. What caught Alexander's eye, however, was the quote attributed to James Wilson, now identified as the NQCI's Director of Private Sector Engagement. "Innovation doesn't respect traditional boundaries or hierarchies. Our goal is to find partners who recognize that groundbreaking ideas can come from anywhere, from established research labs to graduate students just beginning their careers. We're looking for organizations that foster respect, open dialogue, and rigorous but fair evaluation of new concepts." The message couldn't have been clearer if James had addressed it directly to Alexander. This was both a public reminder of Alexander's failure and possibly an opportunity for redemption. The press release indicated that company CEOs would be required to personally present their partnership applications to an NQCI selection committee, chaired by none other than James Wilson himself. Alexander stared at his phone for a long moment, then began composing an email to his executive team. They would need to prepare an application immediately. Expanded access to the NQCI technology could be exactly the bold move they needed to present to the board. But more importantly, it would give Alexander a chance to demonstrate to the board and to himself that he had learned from his mistake, that he could adapt his leadership style to the new reality. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the Pinnacle offices earlier than usual. He had spent much of the night refining his approach to both the board meeting and the NQCI application. For perhaps the first time in his career, he was preparing to lead not through dominance and certainty, but through vulnerability and collaboration. He called an emergency executive meeting before the board presentation, surprising his team with his new approach. "I need your help," he began, words that had rarely passed his lips in a professional context. "The NQCI partnership expansion is an opportunity we can't miss, but my personal history with James Wilson complicates our position. I need your honest assessment. Can we succeed with me as the face of this application?" The stunned silence that followed spoke volumes. The Alexander Grant they knew didn't ask for help or acknowledge personal limitations. Finally, Teresa spoke up. With respect, Alexander, your history with Wilson is definitely a liability, but it could also be an asset if handled correctly. How so? Alexander asked, genuinely curious. A public acknowledgement of the mistake, followed by a demonstration of how you and Pinnacle have changed as a result. Not just words, but concrete examples of new processes, new attitudes toward innovation and talent. Others around the table nodded, warming to the idea. Wilson's quote in the press release was essentially laying out a challenge, added Dr. Chen. He wants to see if you've learned the lesson. If you can show that you have, that Pinnacle has evolved under your leadership because of this experience, it could be powerful. Alexander considered this perspective. It aligned with his midnight realizations, but went further. This wasn't just about personal redemption, it was about institutional transformation. We would need to make real changes, Marcus cautioned. Substantive ones, not just PR moves. New innovation pathways, revised recruitment practices, maybe even structural changes to how we evaluate new ideas. I agree, Alexander said, surprising them again. And we should start immediately, regardless of the NQCI application outcome. In fact, I want these changes to be central to our board presentation today. As the meeting continued, a new energy filled the room. For the first time in months, the executive team wasn't just managing decline or planning damage control. They were building something new. Alexander found himself listening more than speaking, taking notes rather than issuing directives. By the time they walked into the board meeting 3 hours later, they had outlined not just a recovery plan, but a transformation strategy. Alexander would lead the presentation, but each executive would present the portion they had developed, emphasizing the collaborative nature of the approach. The board members were visibly surprised by the shift in tone and substance. Where they had expected a defensive justification of past performance, they received a candid assessment of Pinnacle's cultural and structural weaknesses, followed by a detailed plan to address them. The James Wilson incident was not an isolated error in judgment, Alexander told the board, standing tall despite the admission. It was a symptom of a culture that had become too hierarchical, too closed to outside perspectives, too confident in its own superiority, a culture that I created and reinforced as CEO. He paused, making eye contact with each board member. That culture served us well during our early growth phase, when speed and decisiveness were paramount. But it's not the right culture for Pinnacle's next chapter, where innovation and adaptation will be key to our success. Alexander then outlined the transformation plan, emphasizing the changes already in motion. A new innovation pipeline that would evaluate ideas based on merit rather than source. Revised hiring practices that emphasize diverse perspectives and backgrounds, structural changes to R&D that would protect promising projects from premature judgment. He concluded by addressing the NQCI opportunity directly. We will be applying for expanded partnership status with the NQCI. I will personally present our application to the selection committee, which is chaired by James Wilson. This will not be easy, given our history. But it is necessary for Pinnacle's future, and it is my responsibility as CEO to face this challenge directly. The board discussion that followed was vigorous but constructive. Several members expressed skepticism about whether Alexander could successfully navigate the NQCI application process, given his history with Wilson. Others praised the transformation plan, but questioned whether it represented a genuine change in leadership philosophy or merely a tactical adjustment to current circumstances. In the end, the board voted to support the transformation plan and the NQCI application, with a clear condition. The outcome of the application process would heavily influence their evaluation of Alexander's continued leadership at the next quarterly meeting. It wasn't a resounding vote of confidence, but it was a stay of execution, a chance to prove that he could adapt, that he could lead Pinnacle into a new era. As Alexander left the boardroom, Eleanor Park, the senior board member who had been his most vocal critic in recent months, stopped him in the hallway. "That was impressive, Alexander," she said, studying him with shrewd eyes. "But the real test will be when you're sitting across from James Wilson again. Will you be able to check your ego at the door when it matters most?" Alexander met her gaze directly. "I believe I can. But more importantly, I believe I must. For Pinnacle, for our employees, and yes, for myself." Eleanor nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. "Then I wish you luck. We'll be watching closely." The 3 weeks that followed were among the most intense of Alexander's career. The NQCI application required not just technical details and business plans, but evidence of the corporate culture and values that would guide the implementation of the quantum technology. Alexander worked closely with the executive team, often late into the night, crafting an application that was both technically sound and culturally compelling. He interviewed employees at all levels, seeking perspectives on how Pinnacle could become more open to innovation and diverse thinking. Perhaps most difficult was the personal statement required of each CEO applicant, addressing why their company would be a responsible steward of this critical technology. Alexander wrote and rewrote his statement dozens of times, struggling to find the right balance between acknowledging past mistakes and articulating a vision for the future. The night before his presentation to the NQCI Selection Committee, Alexander sat in his home office, reviewing his materials one last time. The technical portions were excellent. Pinnacle's engineering team was still among the best in the industry. The business case was solid, with clear applications and market opportunities identified. But as he read through his personal statement again, Alexander felt a lingering dissatisfaction. The carefully crafted words acknowledged his error in dismissing James Wilson, but framed it as a learning experience that had led to positive changes at Pinnacle. It was true, as far as it went, but something felt missing. After a moment's reflection, Alexander opened a new document and began typing again, this time without the careful calculation, without the strategic positioning. This time, he wrote from the heart, about arrogance and humility, about the cost of dismissing others, about the painful but necessary process of re-examining long-held beliefs about leadership and success. When he finished, he read it through once, saved it to his tablet, and closed his laptop. This was the statement he would deliver tomorrow, regardless of its strategic implications. For perhaps the first time in his professional life, authenticity felt more important than advantage. The NQCI headquarters in Cambridge was a modern open facility that reflected its collaborative approach to research. As Alexander checked in at reception, he noted the diverse group of researchers moving through the space, young and old, representing various backgrounds and disciplines, all engaged in animated conversation. He was led to a conference room where the selection committee was already assembled. 7 people sat around a U-shaped table with James Wilson at the center. Now dressed in a well-tailored suit, James looked every inch the government executive, though at 26, he was still by far the youngest person in the room. "Mr. Grant," James greeted him with professional courtesy. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Alexander took the single chair positioned at the open end of the U, facing the entire committee. The setup was clearly designed to emphasize the power dynamic. He was the supplicant here, not the authority. "Thank you for considering Pinnacle's application," Alexander began. "I've prepared a presentation on our technical capabilities and implementation plans, but with your permission, I'd like to start with a more personal statement." James nodded, his expression neutral. "Please proceed." Alexander set aside his prepared slides and tablet, choosing instead to speak directly to the committee. 9 months ago, James Wilson came to my office to interview for a summer internship at Pinnacle Technologies. He brought with him a groundbreaking approach to quantum encryption, the very technology we're discussing today. I gave him less than 5 minutes of my time, dismissed his work without proper consideration, and told him he was too stupid to work at Pinnacle. Alexander paused, looking directly at James. That was the most expensive mistake of my career, both financially and personally. Financially, it cost Pinnacle direct access to revolutionary technology and billions in potential contracts. Personally, it forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my leadership style and the culture I had created at my company. He continued, describing how the incident had led to soul-searching and eventually to concrete changes at Pinnacle, not just in processes and structures, but in values and behaviors. I won't pretend that this transformation is complete or that I've become a perfect leader overnight. I still struggle with old habits, with the instinct to dominate rather than collaborate, to judge quickly rather than listen fully. But I am committed to this new path, not just because it's necessary for Pinnacle's survival, but because it's right. Alexander then addressed James directly. I owe you a debt that can never fully be repaid, not just for the technology we're here to discuss, but for the painful but necessary lesson you've taught me. I can only hope that Pinnacle's evolution might serve as partial repayment of that debt, proof that even old CEOs can learn new tricks. A smile flickered briefly across James's face at the last comment, the first crack in his professional veneer. Thank you for your candor, Mr. Grant, James said after a moment. Now perhaps you could walk us through Pinnacle's technical implementation plan? For the next hour, Alexander presented Pinnacle's proposal, fielding questions from the committee members about technical details, resource allocation, and security protocols. The questioning was rigorous but fair, focused on substance rather than trying to trip him up. As the session concluded, James addressed him one final time. We'll be making our decisions within the week. Whatever the outcome, Mr. Grant, I appreciate your willingness to engage in this process with such humility. Alexander nodded, accepting both the statement and its subtle reminder of how different this interaction was from their first meeting. Thank you all for your consideration, he replied. Regardless of your decision, this process has already been valuable for Pinnacle and for me personally. As Alexander left the NQCI building, he felt a curious sense of peace. He had done his best, had spoken honestly, had demonstrated the changes he was trying to make. The outcome was now out of his hands. 4 days later, Alexander was in his office reviewing quarterly reports when his assistant knocked on his door. Mr. Grant, there's a courier delivery that requires your personal signature. She entered carrying a sealed envelope bearing the NQCI logo. Alexander thanked her and waited until she had left before opening it. Inside was a formal letter announcing that Pinnacle Technologies had been selected as one of 5 new private sector partners for the expanded NQCI quantum encryption program. The terms were favorable, better than their existing arrangement with broader implementation rights and lower licensing fees. Attached to the formal letter was a handwritten note on NQCI stationery. Alexander, your presentation to the committee was impressive, not for its technical content, though that was excellent, but for its honesty. 9 months ago, you dismissed me without a fair hearing. Last week, you demonstrated that you've learned the value of listening, of humility, of recognizing that good ideas can come from unexpected sources. This partnership is not a personal favor or an act of forgiveness. It's a business decision based on Pinnacle's technical capabilities and the evidence of cultural change you presented. The committee voted unanimously to approve your application on its merits. I look forward to a productive collaboration between our organizations. James Wilson, Director of Private Sector Engagement, NQCI. Alexander read the note twice, then carefully placed it back in the envelope. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. Jennifer, please ask the executive team to gather in the main conference room in 15 minutes and call Marcus Chen. Tell him I need him here immediately. When the team had assembled, Alexander shared the news about the NQCI partnership, passing the formal letter around the table. He did not share James's personal note. "This is a significant vote of confidence in our new direction," he told them, "but it's just the beginning. The real work starts now, implementing both the technology and the cultural changes we've committed to." He turned to Marcus, the CFO who had been both a critic and an ally during the difficult months following the Wilson incident. "Marcus, I'd like you to take point on this implementation. You've been a voice for change within Pinnacle, and you understand both the technical and cultural dimensions of what we're trying to achieve." Marcus looked surprised but pleased by the assignment. "I'd be honored, Alexander, but this is a CEO-level initiative. Are you sure you want to delegate it?" Alexander nodded. "I'm not delegating responsibility, that remains mine, but I am distributing authority more broadly. That's part of the change we need to make." He looked around the table at his executive team, seeing them with new eyes, not as subordinates executing his vision, but as partners in creating Pinnacle's future. "We have a rare opportunity here," he continued, "a chance to rebuild Pinnacle not just as a technically innovative company, but as a leader in how technology companies operate, how they cultivate talent, evaluate ideas, and create environments where innovation can flourish." The energy in the room was palpable, a mixture of relief at the NQCI decision and excitement about the path ahead. "The board will be pleased," Teresa remarked. "This substantively changes the narrative around your leadership." Alexander smiled slightly. "The board's confidence is important, but it's not my primary concern right now. I'm more focused on whether we can deliver on the promises we've made, to the NQCI, to our employees, and to ourselves." As the meeting transitioned into planning mode, with team members taking on specific aspects of the implementation, Alexander found himself observing more than directing, asking questions rather than providing answers. It felt strange, this new, more collaborative approach to leadership, but it also felt right, as if he was finally growing into a role that had evolved beyond his original conception of what a CEO should be. 6 months later, Alexander stood on a small stage in Pinnacle's largest conference room, addressing the gathered employees at the company's annual all-hands meeting. Behind him, projected on a massive screen, was Pinnacle's new quarterly report, showing the strongest growth in 2 years. "The numbers tell one story," Alexander said, gesturing to the screen. "But there's another story that matters just as much, the story of how we got here and where we're going next." He paced the stage, making eye contact with employees throughout the room. "A year and a half ago, I made a mistake that could have destroyed this company. I dismissed a brilliant young researcher without giving him or his ideas a fair hearing. That researcher went on to develop the quantum encryption technology that is now at the heart of our security products." Alexander paused, allowing the weight of the statement to settle. "I could tell you that I've learned from that mistake, that I've become a better leader as a result, but that would be too simple, too convenient. The truth is more complex and more important." He clicked to the next slide, showing Pinnacle's new organizational structure. Flatter, more interconnected, with new pathways for ideas to flow from anywhere in the company to the appropriate decision-makers. "What I've learned, what we've all learned, is that innovation doesn't respect hierarchy. Great ideas can come from anyone, at any level, from any background. Our job as leaders isn't to judge from on high, but to create the conditions where those ideas can emerge and be fairly evaluated." Alexander continued, outlining Pinnacle's transformation over the past year, the new Innovation Pathways program that had already surfaced 3 promising technologies from unexpected sources. The revised hiring practices that had dramatically increased the diversity of their technical teams, the mentorship initiative that paired senior engineers with new graduates, ensuring that fresh perspectives were valued and nurtured. These changes weren't easy, Alexander acknowledged. They required us to question assumptions that had been baked into Pinnacle's DNA from the beginning, many of them put there by me, but the results speak for themselves. He clicked to a final slide, showing a photo of the executive team alongside a group of young engineers who had developed a breakthrough in quantum memory management, a technology that complemented the NQCI encryption systems and had opened new market opportunities for Pinnacle. "This is what success looks like now," Alexander said, his voice filled with genuine pride. "Not a single visionary leading from the top, but a community of innovators working together, challenging each other, making each other better." As the meeting concluded and employees filed out, Alexander noticed a familiar face near the back of the room. James Wilson, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, much like he had been for his ill-fated internship interview. Alexander made his way through the dispersing crowd. "James," he said, extending his hand, "this is an unexpected pleasure. What brings you to Pinnacle?" James shook his hand with a firm grip. "I was in Boston for meetings at MIT and thought I'd stop by to see how the implementation was going. Your team has made impressive progress." "They have," Alexander agreed, "though I take no personal credit. The team you've been working with, led by Marcus Chen, has done the heavy lifting." "Dude, that's not what Marcus tells me," James replied with a slight smile. "He says your leadership has been transformative, that you've created space for others to innovate while still providing clear, strategic direction." Alexander shrugged, slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm trying a different approach. It seems to be working better than the old one." "Evidently," James said, glancing around at the energized employees still discussing the presentation in small groups. "I have to admit, I was skeptical about whether you could actually change. CEOs with 20-year track records rarely do." "I had strong motivation," Alexander replied. "Financial survival is a powerful incentive." James studied him for a moment. "Is that all it was? Financial survival?" Alexander considered the question seriously. "No," he admitted finally. "It was also about legacy, about what kind of company, what kind of leader I want to be remembered as. The financial crisis you precipitated forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself and my leadership style." "So you're saying I did you a favor?" James asked, his tone light but the question serious. Alexander laughed, a genuine sound that would have been rare in the old days. An extremely expensive favor, but yes, in retrospect, perhaps the most valuable one anyone has ever done for me. James nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. "Well, I should get going. I have a flight back to DC this evening." As they walked toward the exit, Alexander had a sudden impulse. "James, we have an opening for a senior advisory position on our quantum computing team. The role would involve splitting time between here and DC, with considerable autonomy and direct access to the executive team. Would you be interested in discussing it?" James stopped, clearly surprised by the offer. "You want to hire me after everything that's happened?" "Because of everything that's happened," Alexander clarified. "You've seen Pinnacle at its worst and played a key role in our transformation. Who better to help ensure we don't backslide into old habits?" "I'm quite happy at the NQCI," James replied. "The work is meaningful, the impact significant." "Of course," Alexander said quickly. "It was just a thought. The offer remains open if your circumstances ever change." James seemed to consider something for a moment, then said, "I couldn't take a full-time role, but I might be open to a formal advisory position, something that would allow me to continue my government work while contributing to Pinnacle's development." The NQCI actually encourages such arrangements to strengthen public-private collaboration. "We'd be delighted to explore that possibility," Alexander said, careful to keep his tone measured despite his genuine excitement at the prospect. "Perhaps we could have dinner next time you're in Boston to discuss details." "I'd like that," James agreed. "And Alexander, I appreciate the offer. It speaks to how far you've come." As they parted ways, Alexander reflected on the strange circular journey that had brought them to this point. From dismissing James as too stupid to work here to actively recruiting him as a senior advisor, it was a transformation that mirrored Pinnacle's broader evolution under his revised leadership. The quarterly board meeting the following week was a stark contrast to the tense defensive sessions of the previous year. The improved financial results certainly helped, but there was a deeper change in the atmosphere, a sense of collaborative purpose replacing the previous adversarial dynamic. Eleanor Park, who had once been Alexander's harshest critic on the board, now led a discussion on Pinnacle's cultural transformation and its impact on innovation metrics. "What impresses me most," she concluded, "is not just that we've improved our financial performance, but how we've done it. The new innovation pathways have already generated 4 promising technologies, 3 of which came from sources that would have been overlooked in our old structure." Alexander, who was once known for dominating board discussions, found himself listening more than speaking, occasionally adding context or clarification, but generally allowing his executive team to present their portions of the business. As the meeting concluded, Eleanor pulled Alexander aside. "I owe you an apology," she said directly. "I was convinced you couldn't change, that your leadership style was too ingrained, too much a part of your identity to evolve. I was wrong." Alexander shook his head. "No apology necessary. Your skepticism was warranted based on my past behavior, and frankly, your challenging questions helped push me toward meaningful change rather than cosmetic adjustments." "Well, whatever the cause, the result is impressive," Eleanor replied. "Pinnacle is stronger now than it was before the Wilson incident, not just financially, but structurally and culturally. That's a remarkable achievement for any CEO, but especially for a founder who had to reimagine his own creation." As Alexander drove home that evening, he reflected on Eleanor's words. The journey from that disastrous interview with James Wilson to today had been the most challenging of his career, forcing him to question assumptions, behaviors, and values that had defined his professional identity for decades. He had lost billions in potential contracts, faced the possibility of being ousted from his own company, and endured public humiliation in the industry he had helped shape. But he had gained something more valuable, a new understanding of leadership, of innovation, and of his own capacity for growth and change. The words that had started it all, "You're too stupid to work here," now seemed like they had been spoken by a different person. In a way, they had been. The Alexander Grant who had dismissed James Wilson so arrogantly was not the same man who now led Pinnacle Technologies. That transformation, painful, necessary, ultimately redemptive, was perhaps the most important innovation of Alexander's career. Not a technology or a product, but a new way of leading, of listening, of recognizing that brilliance and insight could come from anywhere, even from a nervous young graduate student who didn't match his preconceptions of what success looked like. As Alexander pulled into his driveway, his phone pinged with an email notification. It was from James Wilson, confirming their dinner next month to discuss the advisory role and suggesting they include Marcus Chen in the conversation to ensure proper integration with Pinnacle's existing quantum team. Alexander smiled as he read the message. The nervous graduate student had become a confident government executive. The arrogant CEO had become a more thoughtful, collaborative leader. Both had been transformed by their encounter, their paths now reconnecting in a way neither could have imagined during those fateful 5 minutes in Alexander's office. Life, Alexander reflected as he replied to the email, had a peculiar way of teaching its most important lessons through its most painful moments. And sometimes the words spoken in arrogance and haste, "You're too stupid to work here," became the catalyst for the most profound growth. If this story taught you something valuable, please share it with others who might benefit from its message. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join us next week for another true story about the unexpected ways our words and actions can change lives, including our own. Thank you for watching.